Hello and welcome to my morning note. What could possibly go wrong? A lot of people get a little fed up with doom mongering at the moment, but then perhaps you could give the example of Argentina. 100 years ago, Argentina was one of the most prosperous nations on earth, absolutely part of the club of rich nations. Since then, after many decades of populist rule, which many of us associate in particular with Evita Perón, it has left the club of rich nations. Could that be an example for the rest of us? Well, that at least is the argument of the author of this book, When the Money Runs Out, and it's by HSBC's chief economist, Stephen King, who is with me to talk about it now. Stephen, thanks very much for coming on the video. Let's start by taking a look at some information you get across in the very first page.
Yes.
This shows per capita growth through each decade of your life. Something rather horrible has happened to growth in the Western world in the last decade. Why do you think this is happening?
Well, the most obvious explanation, of course, is the financial crisis. But even before the financial crisis, there was really a significant lack of growth.
Yeah.
And there are a number of reasons for that. The first, I would say, is that we kind of overstated growth from the 50s through to the end of the 20th century because of the benefits of the opening up of trade, a kind of one-off flourishing of trade, the issue of women getting back into the workforce, which is a real positive for growth from the 50s onwards, but that's really faded over the course of the last 10 years. You can only get so many women into the workforce at any one particular point in time. And also the growth of consumer credit, a big, powerful, long-term driver, which was very supportive for growth. But of course now consumer credit is a bit more of a dirty phrase than was the case previously. So for all those reasons, these are kind of one-off boosts to growth which are now beginning to fade.
Okay, so this is one big secular movement. Is there any particular reason then to fear an Argentine-style fate, or could it be more of a Japanese fate? We think of Japan as having done terribly over the last 20 years.
Yes.
It hasn't done terribly, it's just stopped being exciting and it's flattened out.
What's clear already from the data from the last 10 years in the Western world is that we've already had a kind of lost decade, which is similar to what the Japanese went through. The difference really is this, and this is where there's a similarity with Argentina. In Argentina's case, very, very high levels of income inequality. So during a period of stagnation, there's a big political debate about winners and losers, exactly how do you share out the losses associated with persistent economic disappointment. And that's also true today of countries like the US and the UK, and indeed parts of the Eurozone, whereby income inequality is very, very high. So trying to deal with stagnation against a background of some people are very rich and some people are very poor is a very tricky political issue.
Okay, on the subject of the Eurozone, let's take a look. This is a subject you spend a lot of time on in the book. Obviously, there is a big division between borrowers and creditors. You're suggesting that creditors should actually be subject to ratings in the same way that that borrowers are.
Yes.
Take me through how you see this situation resolving itself in the Eurozone.
Well, first of all, the big problem is the increase in the current account surplus for Germany over the period since the euro was first created. Effectively, what the Germans were doing was saving more than they were investing, which accounts for the current account surplus. Yes. Many of those excess savings were then invested in Southern Europe. And I would argue that the creditors of Northern Europe didn't really ask the right kinds of questions about what was happening to their own money.
Right.
So to that extent, we need to deal with current account imbalances, not just from the point of view of punishing those who ended up with too much in the way of borrowing, but also those who effectively lent too much in the first place. The lenders, the creditors need to understand the consequences of their behavior for the rest of the world.
And the startling point from this chart is that Spain and Italy are now virtually back to current account surplus. They have done their adjustments, and Germany hasn't.
Still has a very large current account surplus. And of course the Germans would argue that a current account surplus is a jolly good thing, but the reality is not every country in the world can have a current account surplus.
So very quickly, at the moment, the betting seems to be on in the Eurozone that this situation can be resolved. That's why markets have moved the way they have. Do you think that's overstated, the chances that we can resolve the Eurozone crisis?
I think the ECB is a bit like a sort of painter and decorator who comes into a house to cover over the cracks, which are the result of subsidence. We need to solve the subsidence problem, not to simply cover up over the cracks. And what that basically means is that ultimately to solve the Eurozone crisis, you need to really have a fiscal union and probably some kind of debt restructuring. And neither of those seems likely at the present time. So I think the risks of political upheaval, difficulties associated with austerity will continue for a number of months, quarters, years before we get that final political resolution.
Okay, Stephen, thank you very much indeed. I don't think we're necessarily all following Argentina. But plainly, there are reasons for very great caution. There are suggestions for how to grow again in the back of this book, but they will be difficult to implement.